Washington Square On Air is the audio town square for the Washington Square Review, Lansing Community College's literary journal. Writers, readers, scholars, publishing professionals, citizens of the world gather here and chat about all things writing. Hey there, this is Melissa Ford Lucken from the Washington Square Review. I'm here today, though, as Professor Melissa Ford Lucken with student Rudy Verbos. Hey, Rudy.
Hi.
So tell us, how did you come to LCC and what classes have you taken here?
Well, I'm actually just finished my master's at Michigan State in social work, and I specifically went to Michigan State because they have a combat veteran certificate with their MSU program that you can take, and that focuses on healing moral injury in veterans. And healing moral injury is really, a lot of it is narrative based and focuses around stories and telling your story and sharing stories. And so that made me want to learn more about how you actually craft stories. I'd always been a big reader. My undergrad, I had a minor in English, but writing a story is very different than reading one. And it's not obvious how to construct a story, even though, I've read a ton of books, but I had no clue how to write at all. So I wanted to get a better understanding of how to write a narrative so I can help vets tell their stories, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. How many classes have you taken here at LCC?
I've taken 4 now, I think. I just have 1 more to finish up my degree.
Okay.
So.
Tell us about the creative writing classes you've taken here.
Yeah, I've taken prose style, I believe it's called. I've taken creative writing 1 and 2, which I just finished up with you, and writing the novel thus far. I've really enjoyed them, especially the fiction aspect of them. I really like writing short stories now, which is something I had never saw myself doing. I never saw myself as writing, but I've been keeping at it fairly well for as well as I do things, I think, regularly.
Yeah, it's a life process. It'll come and go.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the prose style and how that did intersection with your MSU social work program.
Yeah, I think prose style was interesting because I'd never really come across creative nonfiction before. Lance had us read Truman Capote, and I think that was really valuable because it shows you that you can emphasize things in a true narrative that may not necessarily have happened that way, but to make the point more clear or to make the story more dynamic or just to give something to your readers. While you're still telling a true story, you can fill in those gaps, which is really, I think it's helpful not only for the storytelling process, but it shows you how stories actually live in the wild. I think people pass them down like that. Their stories aren't static necessarily. So I think that was really valuable in regards to that, because a lot of people, when they approach telling you their story for the first time, they want to get everything 100% right. And I don't think that's necessary. At least that's not what I found in clinical practice anyway. Just tell me, and when they start to tell you, it comes out completely scattershot a lot of times. So I think that gave me more confidence in that that's okay, and you can help people iron out their story that way.
So it sounds like you're talking about 2 different things. One of them is helping people structure their stories so that they can reflect on it and understand it, but then also looking at this idea of truth and how much of it is needed, to tell the story. So when you're talking to someone and they're trying to kind of like get their story out there, and like you said, they kind of stumble and they get stuck on those facts because they want it to be right, how do you move them away from that concern just to really explore their story?
I think it depends on the person, which is a really generic thing to say, but a lot of vets, what you'll have is, due to the wonders of technology, a lot of vets live through things that they never would have lived through before. So now they can hit an IED and roll their truck, and with the armor on the truck and themselves, they can live through that, but they might have a traumatic brain injury or something in that regard. So not only are they dealing with the PTSD, but they also have traumatic brain injury interplaying with that. And so if a vet has something like that going on, they may not be able to tell you the story, and they get caught on that because they might have known at one point, but they don't. And so you can tell them like, hey, we'll come back to that. Just tell me, just get it out. Kind of like you said with the draft, drafting, just get it out, just get it down. So I think in that regard, it helps because you're not worried about it. They're not worried about it. And I think had I not had those classes, I would have been more stuck on going line by line, getting everything right, because I don't know, having written, you see that it's not a finished product immediately. You know, because you do all the revisions, right? And then it's still not very good. So,
and then it can always be revised again and again,
right.
Which kind of loops back to the idea of someone telling their story, because as people tell their stories over time, the story resonates with them differently, and then they revise it and change it throughout their life as they were, it has new meaning in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just finished up My Antonia by Willa Cather, and that novel is really, I think it's about perspective over time. And it oddly enough reminded me both of my masters, but my time here as well, is just how important perspective is to us. Because I mean, that's what you're giving people when you write. You're giving them eyes to see what you see in a lot of ways, I think. And I think that's why it's so important for me to take these classes, is that I want to help people be able to do that, because we don't, especially vets, they don't share their stories anymore. Historically, you had like the Grand Army of the Republic. All the guys came back from the Civil War, and they set up these basically lodges at the time. And then the American Legion after World War I, and VFW. And younger vets don't do that. We're really alienated and kind of isolated.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's just how society is. I think it's technology. You can hide in your own world a lot easier. I think we reward hiding in our own world too, because our phone is, it's just constant dopamine hits for just us, so we don't have to step outside of that. I think it's a lot of things. I don't know. It's a big question.
Do you think that it's a values shift away from someone telling their story that other people can't relate to immediately?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. Historically too, I think at one point the Senate was made up of like 52 veterans after World War II. No one serves anymore because you don't need that big of a military. So when someone goes through 4 deployments in Iraq in 8 years, who do you talk to? No one outside the military can even begin to understand that in a lot of ways. Regardless of the political dimension, it's just the experiences themselves are crazy that they've gone through. And I think why try and explain something to somebody who doesn't understand in a lot of ways is what a lot of vets feel. So you don't get that catharsis of storytelling, which I think is crucial to any sort of healing process.
Yeah, it definitely would feed in, I think, to the sense of isolation.
Yeah, for sure. You're stuck in your own head.
I was thinking about what you were saying about phones, and I, when I teach composition, a lot of times we'll do reflective essays, and I'll try and get students to talk about, technology in their life and the way that it looks. And I think that if somebody grows up, with a phone, they view it differently than someone who grew up without it, because there is no before for them to contrast. And to me, when I think about people's phones, it seems like I was thinking about what you were saying, it just like feeds back your own experience to you over and over again. And I wonder if that makes people less resistant to consider a completely different perspective or a different experience that they're like, I can't relate to that. It's not, it's not my phone already.
Yeah, I think on top of that, we were locked down for a year and a half, roughly speaking, and so that's even more reinforced. I mean, the algorithm feeds you what you want to see, whereas I'm a Youper by birth and by raising, and so we have something up there called the Deer Hunters Roundup, and it was hunters would send in messages to a radio station, and the radio station would play them out. So everyone at their respective deer camps across the county knew where everybody was and who had shot what. And the wives would send in like little poems and stuff. But everyone was listening to Deer Hunters Roundup. Everyone knew where everyone was, and everyone cared about what everyone else was doing. And I think that sense of community, even in small towns, is really gone. So I think it's a technological shift. And I think it's a feedback loop on our own selfishness in a weird way. It kind of preys on our natural selfishness. Not that.
Well, and the other thing is with your phone, if you don't want something, you can just tap out of it, tap to the next thing. But if you're listening to something like what you were saying, is people keep in touch with this, poems and news and updates, you really have to wait.
Yeah.
And so it's a different way of being curious. It's more like curious about what's coming next rather than what can I find next.
Yeah, and it's something I struggled with in grad school. Is I realized I had to sit down and read something. I didn't necessarily want to read that much. I mean, and you couldn't listen to it in audio form either, which always helps because you can do other things with your hands. So I mean, I've had to retrain myself to read. Sit down and read a book, which makes you feel like a child. I mean, it makes you feel like my nephew.
I've heard a lot of people say that though with the reading, that it's something that they say they want to get back into, and then they'll try audiobooks as a way back in, because our brains just get used to moving away from something so quickly.
Yeah, and we're so busy now too. We're reading Willa Cather, they'd have someone stop by. They're like, I'll stay a week, and they end up staying a month and at a farm in the middle of nowhere. It's like, who could do that today? When would you have the time?
It would be great though.
It would. Slow down a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Talk a little bit more about some of the other creative writing classes you've taken here at LCC, aside from the pro style.
I took creative writing 1 with Chris Manning over the summer, and that was a sprint. I was working full time, and I was taking 3 grad classes, and I was taking creative writing, and I was getting married, and I was writing a new piece every week, and it's just ripping through it. I wrote 8 new short stories, and Chris gets to the end, and he says, you didn't have to write a new story every week. And I was like, oh, thanks. But that was really valuable because it kind of pushed me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure.
As difficult as that class is, and having being online, but I found that really valuable. And then writing a novel was really helpful too, because structuring something that big is just enormous. Like when I got out of the Army, I read Moby Dick, and I thought, wow, this guy needs an editor. And then having like structured out my own novel, you're like, wow, and Melville's a much better writer than I am. So that was a really valuable class too. And you also see the structures of stories, which walking through the hero's journey. I had read The Hero's Journey by Campbell, and I'm an admirer of Campbell and Jung, but to actually sit down and try and do it is very much different thing than like, yeah, I can understand how,
Yeah. Can you articulate the difference between the two, conceptually and practically?
Practically, you have to overcome issues in your mind that you don't have to, because I do this with stories now. Is I very much like to plan everything in my head before I write, and then I'll go down to write, and I'll find all these problems that I didn't see in my head, and it makes it difficult to write. So I think you just got to write. You just got to sit down and do it. I think it's much like building a house. Wood is going to warp, and things are going to be different, and the weather is going to be different. So you just it's not doing something in your head is not doing something.
Right. Well, and then once you start to sit, you can have a concept of how the stories are going to go, but then when you sit down to write it, it ends up being imperfect.
Yeah.
And you have to just accept the imperfection, I think.
Yeah, I think too highly of myself in my head too. I think I have this wonderful story. I get it on paper. That's not very good at all.
I think that's really common, because when it's in your imagination, it is like pristine and there's nothing wrong with it. But then when you go to put it down, you realize, oh, what I thought was going to be 3 chapters is now like 1 scene.
Yeah, I think going back to your original question too, with creative writing too and writing poetry, writing humbles you in a lot of ways.
For sure.
Especially, another reason I want to take writing classes is because I think writing helps you read. And it's amazing having taken 4 classes now of specifically just writing. And then like I read The Idiot by Dostoevsky over last summer, and you're like, man, like some people got it and I just don't. I just don't. There's no way I could have that level of talent. Or reading something like The Brothers Karamazov. Like, my God, those people are insane. How do you write that? And how do you write multiple of those in your lifetime?
Right.
I can barely get out a short story in a month.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, what would be comparable to what we have out, publishing now that people will read. Gravity's Rainbow.
Infinite Jest.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's relatively new.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never read Infinite Jest. It's too technical for I couldn't do it. No offense to Wallace, but
no worries. It sounds like we're kind of saying the same thing with the practical issues of writing, as we started off saying, looking at the way the story is imperfect, but telling it, the experience of telling it is worthy and important, even if it isn't so-called perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. My major at Western was history, secondary education. And I think with history, especially teaching it, you're telling a story because you have to keep people engaged. I think that's what humans do. We tell stories. And I think we get caught up in listening to stories as an important thing, or consuming stories, for lack of a better term. But there's entire religions built around storytelling. So it's obviously got something to it. I mean, something very deeply human in crafting and telling stories as well. And I think we miss that a lot.
I think so. Talk about the novel that you're working on for the writing novel class.
I'm working on an existentialist novel set in the Midwest, which I think it's easier to set a existential novel in the Midwest right now.
Yeah, for sure.
Just the Rust Belt. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explore kind of issues of masculinity and just the crisis of meaning in the West through the Midwest specifically. And I'm going to tie that into the military experience in some ways. I haven't quite figured that out yet, I think, but I keep going back and forth on it. And I've just been busy, so I haven't been working on it the way as diligently as I should be.
It's not going anywhere. Can you talk a little bit about the characters?
Yeah, I've got a young man named Abel who was born shortly before 9/11, and 9/11 kind of shapes his life, even though he's not conscious of it, which I took intentionally because when I was in the military, most of my older NCOs and commanding officers joined because of 9/11. And then when I was at Western, I was interviewed because I was one of the last people on campus who was a student who remembered 9/11. And the war was still going on. I'm like, wow, that's crazy that, 20 years in the desert like that we've been fighting. And I think Afghanistan's a graveyard of empires, and the Soviets had a lot of issues with that too. And I think it really deals with existential themes in and of itself. At least that's what I've seen with the vets from Afghanistan specifically.
You think that those vets are different from others that you've met?
I think so. I think closer to Vietnam than anybody else. But World War II, those guys were over there for like a year and then they were back. Whereas, especially some of your special forces, special operations guys that are constantly on rotation. The Rangers are gone like every 6 months. It's nuts how much of war they see, and just the impact of it, the changing impact of war. Or even now, we've got people in South Dakota shooting or using drones and taking out targets in the Middle East and then going home to their family, which has to be a whole nother level of pain that I don't think we've even begun to understand yet. But I think it affects you different. I don't think all war is the same.
Mm-hmm. I've talked to some students when they're working on personal narratives about the experience of similar to what you were talking about, because of things like Facebook. They might be, in another country, as you say, fighting, working, but they can still be in touch with their family, and it's really hard on them mentally because they can't get fully invested in one thing or the other. Yeah,
you've got a foot in both worlds. It's got to be really strange too to just be up with all, to be up with sports and politics and all the information, all the ads we have coming into our brain every day, and fighting a war. That's really strange. I can't imagine that, and it's something that even I think you've seen the change over the course of the wars. Is those guys, when they first went into Afghanistan, they had nothing. They had like satellite phones and that was it, you know, whereas now I'm sure there's people deployed doing TikToks.
Right. Mm-hmm. I would think it would be really hard emotionally to be committed in one space or the other.
Yeah. I can't imagine having a child. One of the reasons I got out of the military is they didn't want to have a family and be in the military because it's so hard. Better people than I do that. But yeah, I can't imagine if, my wife were pregnant and I'm in a battle zone. What does that do to you?
Right.
That's really difficult.
Do you find when you're working with different vets that they tell their stories differently based on their experiences?
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is how close the war is to people. Some people, I don't know how to say this. Some vets, it's immediately there. It's like right in front of them all the time is the way I describe it. And they like kind of walk around trying to miss it all day. And then other vets, it takes more it seems like they've made more peace with it. And I think that affects how they talk about it. I had a Vietnam vet who I was talking to and just brought up his service and he immediately started to cry. And he was 75, I think. And he was still right there. He was that close to his experience still. So yeah, it is really different. And I think we don't know why this is the case, but people just experience things differently. Some guys, this is often forgotten about too, but some guys go through war and just don't have any problems, which I can't explain that. And I can't explain what the difference is with people who struggle and people who don't. I don't think it's a measure of weakness at all, but it's just people are different.
Yeah. I wonder if it's hard for a vet if they are one that is struggling and they meet somebody who doesn't seem to struggle that much. How do they reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think too, the military just changes you, and war changes you. And I think having the common experience because you're just not the same kid that you were, especially with a lot of guys going so young and 18 years old. So I think they'd have that in common, at least that major change in their life. But I wouldn't know. That's a very good question.
Where do you see your work taking you next? You said that you just graduated.
I just graduated. I would love to get a job at the VA long term. I want to work with the VA. I want to go home. I want to go to the Upper Peninsula. The UP actually has the largest per capita population of vets in the United States.
Really?
Yeah. Basically what happened is all work went out of the UP in the 60s, and then the draft came around. So like you had a bunch of poor rural people who were out of work and just draft fodder. In a lot of places, you'll still see the American Legion, the VFW, or the heart of the town community still in a lot of ways. That, it used to be like the Lions Club was there and things like that. Those are all gone now, but the VFW and American Legions are still really strong. So I want to go home and serve my ancestors in a little way.
Uh-huh. How do you think that affects the culture, since there's such a large proportion of vets?
I think there's a lot of respect and a lot of understanding of vets in ways that a lot of people grow up having no family or no stories around that. But since it is kind of all your key people in the town are vets or older vets, especially like I grew up with my great aunts and uncles were all World War II vets, and that certainly impacted me as part of the reason I wanted to go in the military in the first place. But I think it changes your perspective on just what you should do. UPers are known for their hard work ethic anyway, and so I think your level of what you'll accept is just different. You're like, yeah, that's just what you do. At least that's what I've noticed. It's strange, and because people forget this too, but there's a strong contingent in the UP that's very old classic labor. There was actually a progressive candidate who won a House seat in the 1920s for the UP as one of three at the time. So you've got a lot of old school labor there, but you also have like the rural Republicans as well. But still, that same drive and work ethic and sense of service is still there from that. I think it's a bigger thing. I think Americans kind of have that generally, but I think it's more common in the UP.
That's interesting. I was kind of, as I was listening to you, I was thinking back to what we were talking about with the way that stories can help people shape their thinking. And it sounds like vets coming together, obviously they're coming together through a storytelling experience because they have been all in different places. But when they come back together in a space, they're away from the place and they're sharing their stories with each other.
Yeah, I think that's historically like why VFWs and American Legions have bars, and they kind of loosens you up a little bit to tell that.
Yeah.
And when, like when I was growing up, there were no, even when I was in the infantry, there was no women in combat arms. And so these were like strictly male spaces where they were getting liquored up and commiserating, which is a very old thing. That's, and I think you're right. I think there's a lot of catharsis there, which again, now that we've atomized and deracinated a lot as a culture, I think that opportunity has slipped away from the younger vets.
Yeah, well, it's nice when you go into a space and you know that you have that in common with everyone. And if you start sharing a story with other people, they're going to be receptive to it.
Right.
And open to it.
And they'll have some basis of understanding at least, which my great uncle was a corporal in Europe. He's an artillery corporal, and he followed up with Ike through Dachau. And he never talked about it except once when he got really drunk with his wife, but I know he went to the American Legion all the time. So, I don't think it's not so much these men didn't tell their stories that they told them to each other historically. And that's gone. I think that's really dying.
Well, I hear what you're saying about the value of keeping those stories out in the public as much as people are comfortable sharing them so that it doesn't completely get lost.
Yeah, and I think the public needs to hear them. I think that's one thing that vets always had, is that because there were so many of them historically between Civil War, World War I, World War II, it was kind of understood that just generally what these guys had gone through. But now that war impacts us so little in the United States, I don't think the public knows. Right,
everyday experience.
Yeah. So there's a big military civilian divide right now, which is kind of, and I think it's the process of a good thing. Less people are going to war in the United States, which is a good thing. But it has its drawbacks. And I think not only do vets not have the ability to tell their stories to each other, the public doesn't know the stories. Unless they're like through like, I don't know, Lone Survivor or something,
Yeah, and when they come across to us in social media, they're fragmented. They're all little pieces, so you don't ever really get that full thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's strange, and I think it's I think it's got to do with technology. I think technology is driving a lot of this, and we're reacting to it. I just hope I can help some vets tell their stories so you can overcome that barrier a little bit.
Yeah, that's really cool. Switch gears on you. Tell me what you're reading.
Right now, I just got a book off at eBay. It's called Copper Country Tales, and it was published in the 60s, but it's the stories of this Cornish guy. He lost his arm in the mine, and he became a school teacher in the 1920s and 30s, and he wrote down all these old mining stories of the Cornish from the 1870s and 80s.
Oh, where's it set?
It's in the Copper Country in the Keweenaw Peninsula in
Okay,
UP.
that's what I was thinking.
So that's really fun. And then I'm also, I just finished my Antonia, and I'm going to start One of Ours by Willa Cather. I'm doing a survey on the Midwestern authors because, I don't know, I think being a Midwestern is actually really cool, which most people don't. But maybe that's some pride I have from being in the military of my area. So
yeah, there's definitely some consistent themes that you'll find in Midwestern authors compared to, like a Southern or Western.
Yeah, I just finished all of Sherwood Anderson's stuff, and it's funny how you see those kind of like, I can relate to that even though it's 100 years ago. I see that. Those are just kind of fun.
Super cool. Well, thanks a lot for coming by and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for stopping by the audio town square of the Washington Square Review. Until next time, this has been the Washington Square On Air from Lansing Community College. To find out more about our writers community and literary journal, visit lcc.edu/WSR. Writing is messy, but do it anyway.